All right, people, we're here. It's episode 6. We're right at the halfway point. Things are really starting to get going on the next episode of Talkin Thrones. This episode entitled A Golden Crown. Pat, what have you got for our opening material tonight?
Hey, listen, Dom, we're going to settle a great debate here on Talkin' TV, and that's basically, is it better to get a golden crown or a gift certificate to Golden Corral?
I mean, just based off of the decision alone, I think that I might have to go with the Golden Crown option because I've actually eaten at Golden Corral and, oh man, some scary stuff right there. All of that and more on tonight's episode of Talkin Thrones. All right, Pat, episode 6, ultimately. I feel like it's safe to say that right now, at this point, this is the point where Game of Thrones officially takes off, right? It's still not kind of like the big, gigantic blockbuster set piece that, like, it would become later on. But this is the part where it's like, okay, all that action, all of that stuff that had been so tediously and rigorously built up over the first 5 episodes are ultimately starting to take fruition here. What was your thoughts, just first and foremost, after you finished this episode?
Hey, Don, basically, I've been waiting for this one. I basically, every single episode is like, which one is the one with the golden crown? Which one is going to be sort of the end of...
What does that even mean?
Well, hey, man, it's when you get crowned with the gold that you've been waiting for, but it's melted down and
it's not. But yeah, it's hot. Not in the way that you would have thought. Yeah, it's definitely, I think, it's an interesting personification. Obviously, you know, we have another big death in this episode. It's really bad. I'll go back once the season is done and like keep track of like all the deaths throughout that have happened because it's still relatively easy to keep track of the amount of deaths. But this is the first episode that we say goodbye again, not necessarily to a beloved character, I have to say, but to a character that is a credited member of the main cast, right? You know, everyone credits Ned Stark's death. Obviously, we have Robert Baratheon's death coming up in the next episode. But, like, Viserys Targaryen is where I would say, okay, this is the point where it's like, at that point where anyone could feasibly drop dead at any moment, you know? Like, they started small, right? Then they eliminated some big major players from the rest of season 1 who we thought were going to have, like, a big impact going forward, ultimately. It really was an interesting story take, and I think this episode is where we start to begin to grasp that before things really heat up in the next couple of episodes. This episode 6, as I said, entitled A Golden Crown, directed by Daniel Minahan, the first of 5 episodes that he would direct in the show. He would famously direct the next 2 episodes after this, as well as the debut 2 episodes of season 3. This is the only episode of the whole show in which Benioff and Weiss actually had co-writing credits. For the most part, every single episode in the show was either written by Benioff and Weiss or one of the few extra writers that they had on. But this was the only one that they wrote with Buffy the Vampire Slayer writer Jane Espensen. And I find that really, really interesting because this episode is both a resolution episode, a transition episode, and like hinting at bigger things to come episode, you know, because even though I feel like kind of the big moment of this episode happens obviously in the East in Vice Dothraki, there's still a lot going on with the primary 2 storylines that have been set up for the middle part of the season before we start to transition to the last act with the events going on in King's Landing and now the Eyrie. So Pat, do you have like any thoughts on all of that going forward, but like before we actually like get started with the plot recap?
Yeah, you know, basically, I want to say that, you know, even though this episode leads up to sort of that big moment where Viserys gets his golden crown, you know, basically they keep Easteros or you know, whatever it's called on the down low. Essos, there we are. I always mess up the names. It's you know, I should...
Westeros and Essos.
Yeah, you know, so you know, I'll get it right someday. But basically, for the most part, we have this ceremony where Dany's eating the horse heart, and basically, I guess Viserys tries to steal the dragon eggs because he's not going to be as loved as she is, and that's about it. You know, that's like the build-up for this moment when he comes charging into the tent where they're celebrating, and he's drunk and he's wielding a sword, which apparently Jorah tells us is no go. Like, don't do that in this city. And basically he gets his just desserts, right? He gets that golden crown that he's been wishing for. It's one of those sort of like 3 wishes, like be careful what you wish for.
Yep,
it's not exactly what you wish for,
indeed. Absolutely. Yeah. It's crazy because again, like even though Viserys is a character who I will not necessarily say was beloved in any way. He had like a certain kind of like dire wit and charm to him. And ultimately he was a tragic character because he was a character who was kind of robbed. Think about it, right? He was coming off of a royal family that even though they had committed, his immediate family had committed some heinous names and ultimately tarnished the Targaryen name going forward. He came from a long, very, very long, like 300-year lasting dynasty ultimately. And kind of the fact that he was almost like the prince that was promised, right? He was too young when Rhaegar died. He was only like 11 years old. And so he spent like the next like kind of 10, 15 years like having this fantasy built up in his head about his dad. He was a guy who ultimately, felt entitled almost as a means of survival, because it was literally like the only way that like him and his sister could eat because like they went from royalty to beggars overnight. And he was still old enough to remember that versus Daenerys, who was not even born yet when that happened. So it's always kind of fascinating to me how we can break down the psychology of these characters in addition to, even the monstrous ones. I'll even run like profiles like that for when we get to Joffrey and later on when we get to Ramsay as well. The only thing really else that I have to say as far as that goes is that, It's also like the death itself is the first of, I feel like, gruesome deaths, right? Like, to put that in perspective, right? Like, obviously, I feel like by this point in the show, we're kind of desensitized to the amount of hacking, slashing, bloodletting, just in general, that happens. We literally get a beheading and like 3 zombie slaughters in the first episode. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that like this is where we like start to get creative with the deaths. This is like, Golden Crown ultimately. We have wildfire coming. We have death slowly from infection and then future zombification. We have all sorts of different creative ways that this show in this world comes up. Some that don't necessarily mesh with the time period as far as that goes. But I find it interesting that we're going to talk about the Golden Crown because
the main thing is that Game of Thrones, even though it's a decade earlier that this show starts, it has to compete with the likes of Spiral, right? The Saw movie that we recently saw and talked about on your channel. But for the most part, you're talking about the creativities and the deaths, and that's really going to be the suspense that keeps the audience going. Is how will the characters die? Right. I remember this brings up a point. The Red Wedding is sort of the big one that everyone gets shocked about and is surprised. But, they set up the fact that wedding is happening and Joffrey's wedding to Sansa is happening. And I was always waiting for the big stuff to happen at Joffrey's wedding because I knew some stuff was going to go down. And
wait, you mean Joffrey's wedding to Marjorie at that point, or you talk because Sansa married Tyrion? At that point in the show was Sansa married Tyrion, and then after was the Red Wedding, but they were still prepping for Joffrey's wedding.
So for the most part, I will say that was in season 3 was going to be Joffrey's wedding, and the Red Wedding was the end of season 2. And even though season 2 kind of wrapped up, I waited a whole entire year. Like, I know some big stuff's going to happen at Joffrey's wedding, and I can't wait to see how it unfolds. And so I think that, creativity of how, the characters get killed, that basically invests the audience to anticipate what's going to happen in future seasons to some of the characters that we either like or hate, and basically gives us a little bit of a suspense.
Yeah, I agree totally. So without further ado, let's get into the plot recap ultimately of what's going on in this episode, A Golden Crown. So we talked obviously a lot. So again, we'll just break, similar to what we've been doing recently, we'll just break it down into sections of like kind of what's happening in Bachelors, right? So let's kick it off with King's Landing, right? Ned wakes up after his little bout with Jaime in the last episode. He's a little dazed at first. He sees Robert and Cersei over him. Cersei tries to accuse him of starting a brawl while drunk outside of a tavern, which Robert automatically knows is bullshit, right?
They're playing the war of words, like, oh, you were seen outside the brothel, you were doing this. And it's one of those things where, Cersei's playing this very tight game, And, people like Robert and people like Ned know it's all BS. And so it's one of those things that even though the king doesn't believe it, Cersei continues to hammer it home. I guess it's a Lannister characteristic that they sort of do this. And essentially, this is the long play about fooling the masses. It might not fool Robert, it might not fool people in the court, but it's really the court of public opinion that will come into play, and that's what the Lannisters are sort of cultivating.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because it serves not only as a payoff to the moment initially when, like, in the episode 2, right, with the whole direwolf situation between Arya, Sansa, and Joffrey. It's a payoff to that scene as well, just as far as how the War of Words continues. But it's also a payoff as we learn, obviously, we'll learn in the next episode, to Cersei's character as well, where it's like when it comes to any member of her family, she will always, take the high road. Like, it doesn't matter, like, how Robert can kind of interfere and flex his weight as king. Ultimately, it shows that like the Starks and the Lannisters just have polar opposites, edges that just do not allow them to get along in this instance. And of course, what does Robert do? He handles it in the absolute worst way. First, hitting Cersei when she suggests that that she should wear the armor because she doesn't think that Robert is fit to be king, which obviously Robert knows is true, but can't show off in front of his best friend. And also that he decides to ultimately select Ned as his Lord Regent to rule over the slowly crumbling kingdom while he just decides, I'm going to go on a hunt, ultimately. I'm just going to completely abdicate my position right now. I have the perfect right to be able to just go and casually chill and hunt in the woods. And of course, Ned begrudgingly accepts the position because Ned ultimately never knows when to get out, unfortunately, as we saw in the last episode. And really, the rest of the majority of Ned's time is spent just, again, handling the affairs of Robert's kingdom. The big moment obviously comes when he's sitting in the main hall on the Iron Throne, a very interesting sight to see, and farmers come up and tell him that Gregor Clegane is massacring farms in the Riverlands, basically revealing to Ned that Tywin Lannister is marching out his armies as revenge for Tyrion's abduction, and as a result, sends out Beric Dondarrion, portrayed by a different actor at this time. He would later be recast as Richard Dormer, to go out and deal with the Mountain, declaring him a traitor to the realm and declaring that Tywin Lannister be brought into justice. It's a momentous moment, but one that leaves everyone in shock because, as we later learn, Ned has made quite possibly the stupidest decision he could have possibly by just basically declaring outward war on the Lannisters.
Dom, I think it's a really smart move on his part because, for the most part, you're talking about the scene with Arya and Sansa. He's telling them, like, hey, pack your things, you're going back north. And Sansa, for whatever reason, is super, focused on, like, I'm going to marry Joffrey, I'm going to have his kids, they're going to be beautiful blonde children. And that's when Ned puts together that Joffrey is really a bastard of, Jaime and Cersei's, and not really Robert's at all. So he's, with his thinking of honor, is thinking that, oh my God, the Lannisters are trying to steal this, kingdom, and basically, Joffrey is not really in line for the throne. He's sort of, just a pretender. And so this is where Ned takes a very proactive, aggressive step to really fight off the Lannisters, and hopefully, in his mind, he wants to redirect it towards Stannis, which we'll find out more of his sort of haphazard plan to try to correct the wrongdoing that the Lannisters have brought into play.
You're right. The problem and the reason why I say that he goes about it in the wrong way is because, at least if I'm Ned Stark, right, I know obviously this doesn't happen because Ned is a man of honor, right? He responds with big, bold things when dishonorable acts are put upon him, The thing, to me, the reason why he does not have what Stannis Baratheon did, obviously we saw Stannis Baratheon's iron will, but also a willingness to bend and flex, bend the rules in a way that Ned never would, showed that Stannis, at least for a while there, would have been a good candidate for king, is the fact that Ned is constantly trying to solve the problems of far away without at first trying to solve the problems here at court, right? Robert literally leaves him in the middle of a giant mess. He's trying to, besides the fact that the crown owes an incredible debt to the Lannisters, it stands to reason why he would, from an economic standpoint, why he would go after Tywin, but, like, he still doesn't understand that, like, for right now, Cersei is still the queen, and she ultimately still does have power, and there are more Lannisters than Starks in King's Landing, and the fact that he doesn't really take a step back and begin to and realize the danger that's immediately around him, it ultimately shows it's like he's still ultimately not prepared, and it's part of that very reason that leads to him getting arrested in the next episode, because he severely underestimates the actual power that he could have with who he perceives his current allies to be ultimately, and that is, as always, is Ned Stark's flaw. But I'm glad that you brought up that other point, because yes, you're right. It's another big reason why this is an important, momentous episode, because Sansa, ironically enough, and it's even pointed out as a plot point in the book, that Sansa's, at the time, naivete is what allows Ned to get the final clue that, the final clue as to what it is that he has been seeking this entire time, which is, of course, the truth behind Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen's ancestry, that Jaime is their true father, and none of them are Robert Baratheon's children, making them none of them eligible for the throne ultimately. I think it's kind of interesting, the idea that that a bastard, that multiple bastards sit on the throne, right? When the idea of a bastard is so widely outlawed, but it's the fact that like they pass them off as regular children, right? And the fact that that secret is apparently so heinous that it starts this gigantic war that ultimately ravages the kingdom. It's almost kind of not comical, but it's one of those things that I feel like it's like in a more modern sense, it would be like, okay, well, if we had just rectified this one thing, it could have prevented all of this bloodshed, as far as the bastard heritage, like the nature of how the kids were born, that's one thing, right? Obviously, he still wouldn't qualify because he's not actually Robert's son, right? But the fact that like he shouldn't qualify, and so that bastards like shouldn't qualify in some way, like Robert could have still legally adopted him had he found out, even though that never would have happened. But so I just wanted to kind of like get your take on that.
I'm going to say that for the most part, I think what causes this war is sort of what Robert, put his finger on already in the show. And that's essentially that the kingdom has just become squabbling and bickering and whatever you may have. And we see this between, the Starks and the Lannisters. Like, they're basically both sort of like, fighting over like honor and, money and power and all these sort of, basic concepts, the human concepts. But for the most part, Robert is under the belief that there is a higher ideal. And, Robert obviously knows he can't live up to it. But I think Robert's one of those people that puts too much on him. It's like, it's the houses, the families cannot live up to that standard. And I think that's one of the downfalls of Robert Baratheon, is that, instead of just ruling and trying to, make the best of what his situation is, which is king, he basically lost confidence that he's actually a good ruler because he has a higher expectation of what he has. And, I think, with all this bickering and fighting, a perfect example is, basically Lady Stark having Tyrion, and they're in the Vale, and this is the big episode, trial by combat episode 1, where Bronn comes in and he fights on Tyrion's behalf. So I think Bronn is a great introduction here to work with Tyrion, and the characters are so well together throughout the series.
One of the best pairings of the entire series, and there are a lot of great pairings in this series.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, again, this is another squabble that sort of, leads to war. So it's not just like, it's like, Cersei's making mistakes, Ned's making mistakes, Catelyn's making mistakes.
Everyone's making mistakes.
Tyrion, surprisingly enough, is not really making that many mistakes.
Yep.
Jaime's making mistakes.
James making mistakes. Robert's making mistakes. Tyrion's the only one who's like scot-free this season. That's kind of why I liked him for so long. I guess to me, Tyrion was always at his best when he was just outsmarting and everyone around him, and the minute that he started falling ploy and started making similar mistakes, that to me is when he went downhill. Because to me, at least, and this, again, I know it's bad for me comparing it to the books, but to me, just before, at the risk of dipping into focus character segment, to me, Tyrion is always at his best when he's outsmarting everyone. And in the books, the only thing they showed changing after he kills Tywin is not his intelligence and his cunning, but rather just his overall disdain towards people has just grown. Like, he's a lot more isolated. He's a lot less willing to help. He's a lot more bitter and angry. And he starts making just aggressively bigger power moves that ultimately he doesn't necessarily know will work, but he just wants to because he knows that they're going to make big impact decisions in things to come. Like Tyrion at this point in the books where we leave off, which as we know caps off right at season 5, Tyrion never actually meets Daenerys. That's the interesting thing, right? And I feel like we kind of lost something about him, especially since like there was a reason why he is like the chief focus character for a lot of those first couple seasons.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's one of those things where, I didn't read the book, so I can't really speak to them running out of runway and, like having to shift his character. But I think you're right. I think Tyrion, once he becomes sort of, I guess, Dany's hand and is trying to convince her of strategy, he's sort of falling into the whole, there's going to be a war. And, I think the early seasons, Tyrion is sort of, fighting for the realm, which is, our favorite, small council members. What is it? Varys? Varys basically is fighting for the realm, and I think Tyrion's fighting for the realm for the most part. Like, obviously he sides with his family and whatnot, but right. as we know,
that's more so out of obligation, and then we obviously see what comes with that.
Exactly. So I think the character evolves into sort of picking a side and going all in, and basically wants to see sort of the destruction of the Game of Thrones. And so now he's sort of against that and wants to contribute to the fighting. And I think that might be like a huge shift in terms of what we get in the early Tyrion versus the later Tyrion. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and this was probably the last thing about the particular plot of this episode that I need to talk about, and that's, Theon comes across Raz on a turnip truck leaving, or turnip cart, I should say, leaving for King's Landing.
Yes.
And her point of view is, listen, there's going to be a war. Like, basically she is, an employee at the bordello. She's leaving the north and she's going south to get work in the southern bordello. And you're essentially, she knows that the war is already on its way and it's going to take place. And when that war takes place, the men of the north are going to go and die and not return. And she's hedging her bets that there will be more business in King's Landing than there will be in the north for years to come. And it's very smart scene to have Theon kind of have this discussion with her and really set up for the audience that hey, we're going to see some serious stuff the next couple episodes because war is coming. Everybody is starting to move and make their strategies known based on the war that people can see. And it's getting all the way down to sort of the, I guess, peasant level where they can see that the lords are going to fight and war is inevitable. And, it's like Ned Stark doesn't necessarily sort of consider this. Like, he's in the thick of it and he doesn't necessarily see that he's sort of steamrolling everybody towards this big open war.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I think that obviously I think it's just interesting as far as how this shows the power that Benioff and Weiss had when they were first writing the show. But also, again, with Jane Espensen, I don't know how much she actually contributed to this script story-wise, but I do find it interesting that since the theme of this episode is kind of the build-up and the events that lead to the war, before we have the inciting incident in the next episode, ultimately, I think that again, like the power of Game of Thrones is showing how these small micro decisions affect everyone around you in the entire realm, even across the narrow sea. And I think that as meticulous as it is at points, season 1 is so crucial in setting all of that up, and the ways in which it does it, I think, continue to impress me ultimately. The only thing really that I have left to say is this is also the episode that we get a couple of new introduction characters. We have the introduction of the wildling Osha, who obviously is the only survivor of the wildlings that Robb and Theon kill in order to save Bran when he goes out testing his little saddle ride. Bran is just still off just having more dreams about three-eyed birds, and they ultimately decide to take Osha in as a servant when she swears fealty. We obviously, again, have the insane trial by combat with Tyrion and Bronn really starting to show off their bromance, and also having another impressive one-liner, which is, what's it called? Which is, of course, when Lysa says, "You don't fight with honor," and Bronn's response, "No, but he did," to the dead knight that he just pushed through the moon door.
That was definitely a great line. I also,
So
again,
good.
speaking of that scene, it's the whole idea that Tyrion bribes the guard, and, he doesn't have any gold on him, and, this is sort of the strategy at the Vale, right? They put you in those cells with the basically angled floors, so that you might fall out, and it's really to scare you or, let you roll to your death. And basically Tyrion begs to get an audience. He's going to confess his crimes, and that's the whole point of the prison, is to, beg to confess. And so they bring him up, and he starts bringing up, all these kind of BS, really sort of, not suitable for work type comments. And he's making a joke of it all. It's sort of just like a very pornographic description of his crimes, and they have nothing to do with trying to kill Bran.
Fantastic. It's completely fantastic.
Yeah, he's basically making a mockery of it, and this is part of his wordplay, bringing it around to the trial by combat and holding them to the laws of the land. And he basically escapes, but at the end, after Bronn sort of throws the other knight out the sky floor, and basically he gets his purse of gold and throws it towards the jailer, like a Lannister always pays his debts.
A Lannister always pays his debts.
The fact that we see this detail of the Lannisters paying their debts, and basically seeing the myth be perpetrated, I think that is something that is very fantastic character-wise, and we actually see it again throughout this season when Tyrion runs across the hill tribes. He basically he pays his debts when he recruits them to his side as well. So it's interesting how the Lannisters have built this myth and how we actually get to see it utilized within this first season.
Yes, absolutely. It's a continuation of Game of Thrones' uncanny ability to blend their ensembles together. I love that moment. It's one of my top 10 favorite Tyrion moments throughout the show. That's another thing that we're going to have to do at this show later on as we do it, is we're going to have to break down certain characters when we get into the last couple seasons and say what our favorite moments of them are. I'm going to go deep. I'm going to go meticulously with this show. The only thing that we have a couple other smaller moments. Arya with Syrio, where she gives him the famous line, "What do we say to the god of death? Not today." Sansa with Joffrey, obviously, where Joffrey apologizes to her, gives her this big speech about how he loves her and gives her a rose. Robert on the hunt with Renly, Mockingham. Renly obviously finally kind of gets pissed off with Robert and decides to head back. And then pretty much covers the rest of it, other than the detail of Ned finally finding out Joffrey's true heritage. And then, of course, that famous ending. We end in Vaes Dothrak, first with Daenerys touching the dragon eggs and being not burned by them. Obviously, a crucial detail that builds out later on. Her undergoing the ceremony to eat the horse's heart, which will supposedly make her son strong, as he is the Cal's son. Jorah stops Viserys from stealing the dragon eggs, and, of course, the events that Viserys himself does that eventually lead to his untimely death, in which, of course, he threatens Daenerys at sword point unless Khal Drogo gives him what he wants. And so the Khal, of course, it's in this interesting little moment where he communicates to Daenerys without Daenerys waiting for her approval for what needs to be done, and then she gives the approval ultimately. And finally, his two Dothraki blood riders grab Viserys, snap his hands. He throws some of his jewels, his golden jewels, in a pot, smelts them down, and then pours the gold all over poor Viserys' head as he's begging and pleading for his life. And oh man, is it a gruesome scene? And does it ultimately prove, this character was never meant to last this long? But also the fact that this show is not here to play around. It's not quite the equivalent of Big Pussy's death on The Sopranos, but it's this is a pretty big death that happens already almost instantaneously. And those are really the only major other plot points that I wanted to bring up as far as that goes. But again, we do have to offer our condolences. R.I.P. Viserys.
This is called The Golden Crown. And that is a huge moment in this episode. But again, it's like it's competing with the trial by combat. It's competing with, sort of Ned putting all the pieces together that war is coming. Like it's amazing that like so much happens in Westeros, and we just end with this like almost like under the radar moment. It's you almost feel like nothing is really going to take place. With Dany this episode, she's doing the ceremony, she's getting closer to the cow, but like, this is sort of that, big under the radar moment that's like, oh my God, this is very subtle buildup, but this is a fantastic moment because this is when she truly steps out of the shadow of her brother, and he's gone now. She has to fill the shoes of the last Targaryen. So I think it's basically she started off at rock bottom, and now we're starting to see her pick herself up again, and unfortunately we're gonna see her fall right back down to her face for the rest of the season. But I think obviously people familiar with the show realize that numerous times she almost goes back to rock bottom, only to pick herself back up again. And it's really about the overall endurance of her character throughout the series that we're really watching storyline wise. Anyway, Dom, you were telling me earlier that you wanted to talk a little more about Tyrion as sort of our character of the episode.
Yeah, so the reason why I wanted to break down here, right? So my whole thought on the focus characters is we're not going to cover certain characters. We are going to cover certain characters more than once. We're not going to make like every new episode about a certain character, because I want to cover how like certain characters grow and progress throughout the show, right? Because again, that's the beauty and interest of this show. We start off with a certain set of characters. A lot of them die in the earlier seasons, while we have this one set that kind of stays around and witnesses the whole thing. And those are the characters that we really grow and train with. Your Tyrion, Jon, Daenerys, Sansa, Arya, to name a few, obviously. Even other characters like Cersei and Jaime, who are also around for the entirety of it and witness all the events and grow and change in their various and different ways. And so I wanted to kind of start with Tyrion right here. We did Jon already earlier. Littlefinger is around for a majority of the show, but I wanted to start with Tyrion, obviously, because the interest to me for Tyrion at first is always how he's almost treated like kind of the younger. How do I word this? Like kind of, he's almost kind of like treated like the loser younger brother, kind of like the deadbeat brother of the Lannisters, but in a really confusing way, because the only thing that's preventing him from like actually becoming this fantastic lord who would actually be pretty spanking good at ruling is unfortunately his size, as he was born a dwarf ultimately, and is therefore considered of like commonality. And as he even said earlier to Jon, like if he were born to a peasant, he might have been left out in the woods to die, because there was just no way that he would be able to fend for himself. But because he was born in a rich castle to the richest family in Westeros, he's able to kind of thrive. And because obviously Jaime was always the golden boy, right? Their father Tywin always expected Jaime to take over as Lord of Casterly Rock one day. But then Jaime gives that up when he becomes Kingsguard at first to Aerys Targaryen, and then to Robert Baratheon, because a Kingsguard, for similar, while not exactly like the Night's Watch, is similar to the Night's Watch in the sense of a Kingsguard serves for life and can take no lands and father no children ultimately. So the line of the Lannisters is kind of stuck in this weird position where Tywin's golden child now technically doesn't qualify for Casterly Rock. So Tyrion is kind of almost just waiting to get it, and he's kind of like in this really jovial, comfortable position. And the interest in Tyrion's arc is seeing him, how he kind of loses that. It's kind of, first you have like his awakening to kind of his status in life, and it means that he was kind of aloof to, or just didn't really, care enough to really look into the actual implications of that before. And then we see him, like, as he kind of comes to terms with that before finally deciding to jump ship to the other side. It's a really interesting arc that you don't see really just in fantasy storytelling or just in storytelling in general. And so it's always fascinating to me seeing how he starts here, right? He's always the cleverest one. He's always the smartest one in the room. He's always able to outsmart everyone, But you see those subtle moments, right, of him waking up, of him starting to realize, like, oh, wow, like, these are the benefits that I have as a Lannister, and, like, he knows to use them to his full advantage, He also doesn't make certain mistakes that Jaime does, right? He uses his father's name to inspire fear into others, but he also relies on his own skills and wit as well. He doesn't rely entirely on that in a way that Jaime does. And you see Jaime suffer in ways that Tyrion is able to escape from, in scenarios that Tyrion is able to escape from later on in the show. And so that's kind of just what I wanted to talk about, because everyone always talks about the idea of Tyrion is the best character, and I always wonder, I'm like, okay, what is it about him? Because it's because it starts off because he's the funniest character on the show, but after a while, it becomes like there's a much deeper tragedy and implication that motivates him and ultimately shows that when given a position, Tyrion could really not only be a spanking good ruler, but just be good in general for the maintenance of the realm. I'm kind of wondering, I'm like, wow, while Varys was trying to go after all these people to rule, all these people that were descended from big, powerful families, he didn't realize that he had the right person literally standing right there next to him the entire time.
Yeah, Tyrion, again, we've already talked about it earlier when we were talking about the recap, but, the whole trial by combat sequence, right? He's in the prison. He's trying to bribe the guard in a traditional way. That fails. And he then realizes that they're kind of torturing him and he has to confess his crimes. And so he gets himself back in the throne room and throws hey, this is how justice is done in this realm. And you have to give me these certain things. The king is going to uphold this, and etc., and sort of talks his way into the trial by combat. At first, he wants his brother Jaime to sort of show up, but they're like, no, the trial is going to happen today. We're going to have a resolution. And, I think the whole entire time, he's basically goading Bran, not Bran. That would be weird if he came from Winterfell. But Bran into being his champion. And when he essentially becomes a champion and wins, I think another moment when he throws the purse to the guard who basically got him the audience in that chamber, and he says the Lannisters always pay their debt. He's really wants Bronn to stick with him to get back to King's Landing. So it's almost like Bronn, you're a very intelligent soldier. Stick with me and you'll be rewarded greatly. Not just a purse of gold, but the Lannister's going to pay his debt, and Bronn's going to, as we later know, be offered sort of titles and lands. I think that's sort of the long game, and we could start seeing that right there in this episode.
I think the irony of the term "a Lannister always pays his debts" is the fact that Tyrion is the most honorable Lannister. He really is the only Lannister that truly does pay his debt. Every other Lannister that we've been introduced to on the show has been shifty in some way, shape, or form. We haven't met Tywin yet. We're going to meet him in the next episode, but Tywin rules everything completely out of fear, and for the most part is just mitigated in how to make his family the most powerful ultimately. Cersei is all about backstabbing and betraying and manipulating in order to get her way. Jaime just wants to fight everyone ultimately, and really just beat everyone in combat, and Joffrey is just a sniveling little coward ultimately who just wants to dominate everyone in the worst ways possible. None of the Lannisters are intent on paying their debts. If anything, they're intent on getting out of their debts, and Tyrion is really the only one who kind of embodies the meaning of that statement.
I think it's the meaning of the statement. Everyone thinks Lannister always pays their debt. It's like, oh, I owe you some gold, I'm going to give it to you. It's really about they're going to make stuff happen. If gold is the thing that pays off the debt, they're going to give it to you. If basically going and murdering someone so that you can kind of take over their territory, if that is a way of paying their debt, they're going to do that. So it's really just the whole idea of stick with us and we'll make sure that you're well rewarded. And it's sort of like a call for loyalty too, because you need to stick with us. You need to sort of, make this deal with us, and then you'll be rewarded. And so I think it's the rest of the Lannisters probably use it a little more cynically than Tyrion does. Tyrion is probably a little more brings honor to it, where the rest of them sort of make it clear that it's an exchange. A little bit of what you want for a lot of what we want. So, it's a very interesting tactic that the Lannisters do take, and it's interesting to see how different each of them handles it.
Yeah, ultimately, at the end of the day, Tyrion is a man who has big aspirations and ambitions, but has kind of at a point in his life where he knows not to necessarily strive for them because he's seen what that does to other people, and because he knows he kind of has this understanding in a way that not a lot of other people do, kind of the implications of what that power does to people, as he sees multiple times throughout the entirety of the show. The fact that the decision to constantly keep Tyrion in a place where he's not in a position of power is an interesting one at first, but ultimately I think proves kind of lackluster, because you almost begin to wonder, especially after seeing how much of a badass he is in the next season, just like what would happen to Tyrion if he were in a position of power. You know, we'd see what happens to Daenerys, right, as far as that kind of be, but that still feels like too much of a twist on her part, right? A Targaryen that we, naturally is good, then going evil ultimately. It almost feels more interesting if we have Tyrion in a position of power ultimately. That's kind of the point that I want to end on, right? As far as like a kind of a future tidbit to explore with this show, as far as, once we start to discuss alternative possibilities of where the show could have gone once we get into the last couple of seasons, is like, what if Tyrion did end up sitting on the Iron Throne, And since considering the fact that in the last episode he's literally a prisoner, but he can tell them that Bran's king, if he could just like basically be like, yeah, I'm king now, And literally when everyone else is like questioning it, he's just gonna be like, who else is smart enough to rule you guys, And I just don't get why he didn't do that,
The final episode, basically, they're like, prisoner, please tell us what to do, and it's like,
please,
what?
We literally have no one else.
Like, legitimately, you don't usually walk into your prison and say, hey, why don't you tell us what to do? Oh, you want the key to the kingdom? Sure, we'll let you
also,
have it.
how is Davos sitting on that? How is Davos sitting on that council? How did he not get thrown in jail? I thought he basically just like did everything that Jon did.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like Davos is sitting on the council at the end. I don't know. It's a long time. We're gonna be here all night if we do that. But only a couple more points that I want to hit. Only a couple more points that I want to hit before we talk about the death count.
You wanted to talk about the trial by combat, didn't you?
Yeah, I want to talk about trial by combat, basically. So it's interesting because trial by combat, it's a pretty self-explanatory thing, basically. It's like you're in a trial, you're basically don't see a way out, so you could literally just like demand that someone represent you in a fight, or you represent yourself in a fight. And instead of like having instead of a lawyer getting you out of your sticky situation with words, you basically just like have somebody fight to the death for you. And if you win, then you're good. If you lose, then you're not good. Ultimately, it's the easiest way as far as settling a dispute. And I thought I should have known better. I thought that it was a thing that was exclusive to the show, but little did I know, and did I come to find out, thanks to Google, of course, that trial by combat is actually a real thing. It was a method of Germanic law to settle accusations in the absence of witnesses or a confession, in which two partners in dispute fought in single combat, with the winner being proclaimed right. So I love the fact that like Game of Thrones ultimately tides the line between like perceived beginnings of civilization while still maintaining these very archaic like kind of rituals as far as we go. There's a lot of vow pledging.
Right, yeah. Tom? Into what is it?
The
Aaron
religious
Burr?
Fealty. Yep.
Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. With the founding of our country, they had a little bit of a duel to see who was right,
if you will.
So it's one of those things. It's a very human thing, I guess, in our society over the centuries, to have some sort of trial by combat.
Yeah, ultimately. As we know, it's utilized by Tyrion twice in the show. First, obviously, in this episode, and then later on in the aptly titled Mountain the Viper, when Oberyn Martell represents him in a fight against Gregor the Mountain Clegane, ultimately. And what's interesting is that there was another big event that was constantly hinted at, right, as far as connections to the book, right, that being the Clegane Bowl, right, the thing that emerged when people were looking forward to, like, okay, so there's this perceived upcoming fight between the Hound and the Mountain that's coming up, when are we going to get that? And then ultimately that results in what it results in the penultimate episode. But I almost wish that, like, kind of, the idea in stories being that everything works in threes, right, beginning, middle, and end, right, if you set something up like a joke, right, you can really only use it twice more in something, because if you use it more than 3 times, then it starts to become, you start to have to make fun of the joke in and of itself, so the original joke kind of loses its meaning. There's a lot of like kind of like more micro things that I can go to as far as how important the power of threes is to storytelling. But I think that ultimately another thing that's pretty lackluster is the fact that Game of Thrones final season just ultimately just left certain plot lines just dangling right there. And I again once think that, like, man, what if the Clegane Bowl had been an actual Clegane Bowl and like an actual trial by combat in which the Hound had to represent someone in a fight against the, now zombified mountain at that point. I just feel like, missed opportunity as far as that goes.
Yeah, I think that that fight could have happened sooner, and I think they just sort of waited way too long, and they just sort of, obviously they come together in this castle and they fight. And it just didn't have, like you're suggesting, the story backing to make it a super exciting scene. It's sort of,
right.
Okay, it's just a fight scene. Not too bad, but ultimately it didn't have the story momentum behind it. It kind of lost its momentum since they pushed it back way too long. So, it's one of those things I was glad to see it, but at the same time, it just didn't live up to sort of the hype that, myself and you and other fans got into.
Yeah. Ultimately, I agree with that at the end of the day. So that's really all I have to say as far as trial by combat goes. The only thing that we really have left are the death count and and banter, ultimately. So this will be the part, obviously, where Eric, I know you're watching. Thank you once again for being a loyal watcher throughout this entire thing. So just throw up some comments as far as that goes. This is the time to engage with the chat, ultimately, while Pat and I go over the death count of this episode. So it's funny because originally I thought it was really just the one. I thought it was just Viserys. But as it turns out, there is actually a couple more that happened in this episode as well.
Well, the horse dies, right?
Right, the horse dies, yes. And then it's the couple of wildlings that obviously Rob and Theon kill. You have the I think it's Rob kills 2, and then you have the big one that's holding Bran hostage, and Theon then shoots him in the back with an arrow, and then Rob chastises him for almost killing Bran. And it's like, bruh, do you see how short Bran is? He hasn't gone through puberty yet. Like that arrow's not going anywhere close to his head, So I thought that was a little bit funny ultimately. But yeah, not a very high death count, but we're getting there. Like the real bloodbath is yet to begin. I think next episode we have a couple of big deaths that happened, and then just the last 3 episodes, it's just like complete bloodiness from beginning to end. Ultimately, there's like 30 people that died between the last 3 episodes alone.
Yeah, I think what is it? 7, 8, 9, and 10. Yeah, there's 4 episodes left. So for the most part, it's a roller coaster ride going forward, and it's going to be very interesting to watch these episodes again, and remember what happened to end season 1. So I look forward to that.
Indeed, yeah. So it doesn't look like we're getting any comments, unfortunately, so it looks like we might have to end it a little early tonight. But thank you guys once again for tuning into yet another episode of Talkin Thrones. Pat, did you have any closing thoughts before we got out of here?
No, man. It's again, I look forward to watching the next couple episodes. So we'll go with episode 7 next week. I forgot the name of that. I guess I could look it up. But
You win or you die.
Oh, yeah.
When you play the Game of Thrones, there is no middle ground.
That is a good phrase for this show.
It's a great
sure.
title. It's a great title, and the more that I think about it, I think that episode might be one of the 10 best episodes. Like 9 and 10, obviously. Well, I mean, Baelor obviously is in the top 10, because that's the other thing too that I'm gonna do once this show is done. Once we're done recapping the show, is I'm gonna obviously have my overall top 10 best Game of Thrones episodes, and I definitely know for a fact that Baelor will be in there, but I don't know if you win or you die. There's some obvious other locks, like Blackwater has to be in there. Reigns of Castamere has to be in there.
Yeah.
Battle of the Bastards has to be in there. Like the big momentous ones. But like I like to make it an even mix of like the more low down, like really personable episodes.
Yeah, well, let's get through all the episodes first, and then you can count
take a
those
while.
down.
It's gonna take a while.
Yeah,
ultimately.
for sure.
But,
Anyway, so Dom, basically, I know you're gonna ask me where I can be found. And
yes, Pat. Are you ever actually going to post anything? Is the ultimate
I swear
question.
I take a bunch of photos, and then like
summer is here. You don't have an excuse not to.
No, the real issue is Instagram's main interface is on the phone, and it's like I do editing, photo editing on my computer and stuff, and then I got to transfer it back to the phone. Instagram is designed to be sort of a couple clicks and done on your phone, and I don't treat it that way. So eventually I'll get the work done, and I'll just put a bunch of photos on there. So,
nice.
But at Patrick W. Huber on Instagram, that's where I swear I'll post something at some point. But hey, Dom, besides Talking TV,
it's
the
like,
YouTube
besides
channel,
Talkin TV,
where
which
can
of
they
course,
find you?
thank you guys once again for watching another episode of Talkin Thrones. If you click the subscribe button, you click the bell next to it, you click the like button. That way you guys will get notified every time we put up new content. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast, where I post pretty much every single day, twice a day. And you can also find me on my personal pages at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. I don't think there were any sarcastic posts today, ultimately, other than just alerting you guys of the existence of these episodes. As I know, I said we went a little early, but we'll be back next week with another tremendous episode. Ultimately, like I said, this week was a big episode. Next week is a big episode, obviously, with another gigantic death. And it's just onward and upward from there. 3 more episodes until the end of the first season, and then onward to the rest of the show. It's been great chatting with you guys, as always. 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time on the next battle for the throne.